Last March, Art in America published a 10-page article on Michelle Grabner titled The Pragmatist. It's a fitting label for someone who's taken a can-do approach to doing it all. Her diverse career encompasses multiple roles: artist, curator, writer, and professor and chair of the painting and drawing department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Not one to subscribe to the conventions of contemporary cultural production, 11 years ago, she and her husband, Brad Killam, also a fellow artist, were dissatisfied with the state of the Chicago art scene. So they started their own exhibition space in a small 8-by-8-foot cinder block outpost, I guess you could say, in their backyard of their Oak Park home, aptly calling it the Suburban. Over the past decade, a lengthy roster of artists have taken advantage of this pro-artist, anti-curator gallery space, as well as the free lodging in their family home, being given complete control to produce and exhibit whatever they want. More recently, Michelle and Brad started another exhibition space called the Poor Farm, located in rural Little Wolf, Wisconsin, which plays host to writers and artists. As for her own practice, Grabner takes a methodical, meditative approach to making paintings, which have been exhibited internationally and are often ordered around simple mathematical systems, referencing the patterns of hooked rugs, printed fabrics, and spiderwebs. Process and learning about the practices of other artists is Grabner's passion. She says, I quote, "I'm totally interested in what artists do, and what artists do is not necessarily the same thing I do up in the studio, which is very narrow and very reductive." So what better way to understand what artists do than to enter their studio? In her recent publication, The Studio Reader on the Space of Artists, which Grabner co-edited with Mary Jane Jacob, artists, curators, art historians, and critics write about the artist's studio, a space that is often thought of in the cultural imagination as an elusive and reclusive one where the artist's magic happens. Tonight, Michelle will pull back the curtain, so to speak, and talk about activities of artistic production, including her own, and touch upon questions like, what does it mean for contemporary artists to be in the studio, and what does the contemporary studio look like? Please help me welcome Michelle Grabner.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Eric. It's great to be in a terrific exhibition here, which is lasting through the end of April. So terrific. Okay, so as Ashley said, I'm going to talk about my practice, but it's really important to talk about some of those other things that she set up as well, including the Suburban and the Poor Farm. So I'll get to that, and you'll kind of get a sense of how those activities set up my own studio practice. So we'll get there in a little bit. But before we get going, I'm going to talk about the studio. But prior to that, I'm just in terms of introduction and elaborating on what Ashley said, just a couple things in terms of my own philosophy. I am compelled and devoted to education and arts in all form. I hold a deep appreciation for the act of making and the interrelationship between seeing, doing, and learning. And most importantly, I recognize that this interrelationship and the speed it requires to participate in these interrelationships is political. And I'll talk about that in terms of the kind of political momentum that comes with all of these other activities, that comes with these activities. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the studio and the studio reader in terms of how it came to be. It was interesting. Mary Jane Jacob, a colleague of mine at the School of the Art Institute, she's executive director of exhibitions there, and she was kind of fishing around. She was talking to faculty about ideas, exhibition ideas, and so forth. And this was approximately March 08. And in March 08, we were still in the height of the market boom, and we weren't talking about the studio. We were talking about consumption. We were talking about display. And I really wanted to kind of pull back. I wanted to actually look at what artists are doing and not the kind of other end of it. So that's the studio reader. And of course, in the process of crafting the studio reader, the market collapsed. So it actually forced me not to just be antagonistic, not to just kind of push at market forces to look at a different condition, but to actually kind of look at it more deeply. So it was quite advantageous. And as Ashley was saying, some of the questions we were looking at: what does it mean to be in the studio? What is the space of the studio in artistic practice and life? Is it there that artists realize their own artistic agency and self? Does creative potential originate in the studio, or only take form there? So those were some of the questions that started to evolve after the initial kind of just pushing at the context of a lot of contemporary art and the discussion around contemporary art. So what I'm showing, I'll just go through a couple of images of contributors to the Studio Reader. And what we're looking at here, some of you may know, is Bruce Naumann's Mapping the Studio, Fat Chance, John Cage. It was a project he did in 2000 in his studio in New Mexico. And it's interesting because it does go back, it starts to kind of suggest some of the work he was doing in his San Francisco studio in the late 60s in terms of these tasks he would set up within the studio, for instance, building flower structures, powder flush structures each day and so forth. And what we're looking at here is a pretty large, ambitious video installation in which he used an infrared video camera and recorded activities, the night traffic in his studio for 1 hour each night for over the course of 7 months, and he ended up with 42 hours of footage. So he was really interested in letting the infestation of mice that kind of moved into his studio and his studio cat kind of be the map, kind of be the way of how he's thinking about the studio. So as you watch the video, and again, some of you probably seen it, it's been on display at the DIA Beacon for quite some time, and we see it in different contexts. But again, you see various aspects of the residue of projects that never came to fruition, projects that kind of broke down. So that's what you're looking at here. And Jim Welling, who I've worked with at the Suburban, a kind of great guy. Jim Welling is a photographer based in Los Angeles, professor at UCLA. And what you're looking at here is a Polaroid from 1976 titled The Studio. And he inherited a malfunctioning Polaroid camera back then and tried to get it fixed, didn't work. And what you're looking at here is how he came to capture, he ended up using the studio as subject matter because he wanted to get this camera to work. So just basically through exposure, using the cap on the camera to create these images. So that's what we're looking at here. And then clearly we have this phenomena within institutions, the recreation of the studio. It's been going on for a while, and I think the most classic one is Francis Bacon's studio, installed in Dublin, at Hugh Lane Gallery. And this is his studio in Kensington, London. And it's installed in a large plexiglass kind of container room. And viewers looking in at Bacon's studio, it's kind of difficult. You don't get to walk through it, so views are conditioned. Frames are set up in which you come to understand him and perpetuate the myth of Bacon and so forth. And then there's, as you kind of move through, walk through, kind of glancing in the studio, there's other kind of didactic rooms that follow. This is Danelle Wolford. Danelle Wolford is a fictional artist invented by the artist Joe Scanlon. I'm going to read a little bit. I got a few things I want to read. I'm going to read a little bit of Scanlon's contribution to the Studio Reader, talking about the post-post studio condition. In this decade, a few artists like myself are trying to rejuvenate the studio as a site of production by enlisting others to inhabit it for us, thereby outsourcing the labor of making art as well as the burden of authenticity, the burden of being studio artists ourselves. In what might be called a post-post studio practice, the idea of the studio artist makes a comeback. Only now the artist is a paid actor performing on a set designed to look like an artist's studio. If the work that the artist actor makes or pretends to make, it is just as good. It shouldn't matter whether the artist is real or not. So Scanlon's being cheeky here, obviously, in terms of challenging. He enrolls actors to play Danelle Wolford, and he makes these works, but it's kind of a way of vetting his own work. So it's pretty interesting, and we'll talk about that. He also did a project at the Suburban. Charlene Van Heil, a New York-based painter, splits her time between New York and Marfa. Charlene, this is just a photograph that she sent to us to be included in the book. So we see this kind of singular chair, something very different than Scanlon's idea of the post-post studio. It's her chair. It's covered in paint. You can see the paint splattered floor. And Van Heil ended up taking a very poetical approach to thinking through the studio. She says, the idea of the studio is as much a fantasy as the idea of the artist is a fantasy. Both cease to exist when the work begins. If there is work, there is no studio, there is no artist. The studio is the vault of the self-feeding vampire. It is a studio, and stew here is S-T-E-W, laboratory for inspiration, stagnation, confrontation, resignation, procrastination, contamination, inflation, reflection, intoxication, regression, and invention. David Robbins. David Robbins is an artist right now based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Has a career, a full life of moving through the world. Robbins' studio is not the traditional kind of workplace, it's the office space. So when we think of studios and studio conditions, whether it's the home studio, the office studio, the garage studio, and so forth, we see here just a combination of images from his home studio, which is an office. And he says, the idea of working in a studio makes me uncomfortable, always has, as has thinking of myself as an artist. Both terms presume that my motive is to make art, whereas much of my career has been dedicated to searching for new modes of thinking and creating that offer sophisticated alternatives to art, and adding those to a pool of possibilities. I prefer to think of myself as the contemporary independent imagination rather than an artist. Maybe you can recognize Willem de Kooning. This is de Kooning in his studio. This dates from, 1983, his East Hampton studio. And what's interesting, Rob Storr's contribution to the studio reader actually talks about how uncomfortable de Kooning was with his own success and actually the wealth that came with that success, and how he would dump that wealth into this kind of extraordinary studio. He goes into detail in terms of how de Kooning ended up creating a kind of lofted bedroom, so when he would wake up in the middle of the night or early in the morning, he could look over and see the work that he created. He also created a promontory, a walking space over the studio in which he could actually look at some of the drawings and get yet a better grasp of the studio, what was happening, what was in the making. And so forth. So Storr's theory, Rob Storr's theory, is that again, taking a lot of the wealth and dumping it back in the studio is very uncomfortable with that kind of success. Marjorie Wallisch has a couple of wonderful contributions to the studio reader. She talks quite a lot about the studio visit and the conditions that surround a studio visit. What should the visitor be asking and looking for, in addition to being a good listener, and what should the artist convey to the visitor, and so forth. So she has done several pieces, 2 essays actually contributed to the studio reader, in which she looks at that. But she's also an interesting artist, in addition to being a writer. And what we're looking at here is just an installation from her studio. Wallisch actually breaks down into frames several functions of the studio. Her studio is comprised of the mimetic studio, the pragmatic studio, the expressive studio, the objectivist studio, the discursive studio, and the reading studio. So all these things really have to come together to be full for Marjorie. I like this installation quite a lot, this installation of paintings. This is by the New York-based artist Rochelle Feinstein. And this piece is called Before and After, and it dates from 1997 to 1998. And what we're looking at, before would be on your left, and then after would be on the right, and kind of a cynical version that works end up going back into the studio, back into the racks. This is a large-scale charcoal drawing by the LA-based artist Carl Handel. This is actually installed at the Suburban, the space that I run in Oak Park with my husband. This is from 2008. And Carl's contribution to the studio reader is really a relationship to the studio that is more like home. It's a proper studio. He has assistants, massive amounts of overhead projectors who help make these drawings. But he will send the assistants home to take care of plumbing or to do the weeding or the gardening. So the studio is the primary place of location for Carl Handel, and a place of comfort. So he's kind of inverted those two. So it's not compressing the studio into the home. It actually is still having these separate entities, but kind of reversing the roles. And what you're seeing here in this charcoal drawing are studio things. This is the stuff that he would pull out of his pocket at the end of the day, throw it on a copy stand, take a photograph, and then use this as a still life, a kind of subject matter. These are the things, again, that he has great comfort with. So I'm just going to read a little bit from my introduction to the Studio Reader. Just in terms of the text itself, many contributions by artists just reflecting on their own studio, from an artist based in Los Angeles named Shauna Lutger ended up recording all of her dreams in which the studio made an appearance. So they vary in terms of approach and style as well. Michel Desarreau's metaphor of the motionless train car as a sort of God undone is apt when examining the space of the contemporary studio. The romantic studio encoded in individual creation is also in a continuous state of becoming undone. The workshops of William Morris and the Bauhaus, Frank Lloyd Wright's home and studio in Oak Park, Warhol's factory, Beuys's pedagogical experiments, the decentered practice of Fluxus, and the anti-studio positions of the 60s and the 70s shaped a catch-all post-studio condition on the traditional European studio ideal. Daniel Barron's seminal 1971 essay, The Function of the Studio, maintains the studio's status as a unique space of production while also calling for its disintegration. He says, "The work is made in a specific place, which it cannot take into account. All the same, it is there that it was ordered, forged, and only there may it be truly said to be in place." So there you have it. So there's the kind of the frame of the Studio Reader. Ashley asked me earlier. She said she asked me, which contributions kind of really took hold. Which ones were you surprised with? And quite honestly, when you're in the middle of book craft, it's pretty amazing how abstract the whole content becomes, and how far, as I was getting into, as I was doing more research, how very abstract the idea of putting language to the studio and my own experience going into the studio, how the divide that created, the kind of space that started to be exposed. So quite unnerving, actually. In a kind of narrative to get to my own studio practice, I really do have to bring up the Suburban and the Poor Farm, and I'll go through both of those kind of quickly. But it's important to realize that both the Poor Farm and the studio end up playing out social conditions that I don't bring into my own studio. I have a very traditional studio practice. So it's important to get a sense of these other things that kind of shape how I can be in my own studio. So this is the Suburban. This is one space. Some of you have been out there, and all of you are welcome to come at any given time, as well as the Poor Farm. I welcome you all. But we have two exhibition spaces. They're very, very small. The one that you're looking at here, this is early on. It's freestanding. You'll get a sense of it as we move through. It's 10 by 10 square feet, and then the other space is approximately 10 by 20. So they're still relatively small exhibition spaces. And I was, as I was suggesting earlier when I was talking about the Studio Reader, Frank Lloyd Wright's home and studio in Oak Park is fundamental to how we've come to understand the idea of the imagination, or the compression of a private space and a public space. The private space being a domestic location, the home, and a public space of exhibition. A social site located between private sphere, as I was saying, of the domestic life and the public sphere of exhibition. And, the majority of this takes place during the openings. 90% of our visitors will come out for the opening of an exhibition. And here I'm showing you the third exhibition. So this goes back to 1999, 11 years ago. And what you're seeing here is kind of in honor of somebody who is doing a project similar to the Suburban. So the Suburban is not a commercial gallery. It is not a not-profit space. It is this kind of independent off space. And here we have a project by Dave Muller. And Dave Muller was hosting at that time. He stopped the practice of 3-day weekends. He would have these activities. He would have these exhibitions of his mates, and he was working for Mike Kelly at the time, so where Mike Kelly would have exhibitions, whether it's in Europe or the States somewhere, he would gather some work and some projects from some of his artists from Southern California, and you would find spaces and mount exhibitions. So what you're looking at here is kind of an excellent example of how Dave was thinking about the idea of a 3-day weekend. So that kind of gray backdrop that looks like a wall is actually a canvas by a colleague of mine based in Chicago named Galen Gerber. He's a platformist artist, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. And then the text, which you can't read, is actually instructions by the artist Sam Durant, instructing Dave to actually get 8 hours of sleep when he is, on these 3-day weekend excursions. And these 3-day weekend excursions, if you're working, if you're hosting this project and you're working for Mike Kelly and you have to socialize, sleep is not part of the equation. So Sam was really kind of taking it on in terms of thinking about Dave's well-being. The table that you see in the foreground is actually a piece by his dealers, Blum & Poe, based in Los Angeles. They designed this table, and you can see the little motif, this little riff on a John Wesley painting. And then the folders, the file folders that you see stacked in the table are just a catalog that Dave created for the exhibition. Outside, we had Mungo Thompson's Wind Chime, so there was other people participating in this 3-day weekend. This is an exhibition that happened in the summer of 2009. This just gives you, kind of orientates you to the physical space of the property. The house, you can't see it's off screen, it would be your right. So that Suburban, that small little kind of cubic architecture in the middle with the text wrapped around it is one of the spaces. And then the building that you see to the left has 2 exhibition spaces, another Suburban space, and then Shane Campbell Gallery has his project space there as well. So if you come and visit at any given time, you'll see 3 exhibitions, and my studio is on the second floor. And what you're looking at here is an exhibition by a group of 3 artists who went through the Dusseldorf Academy, and they call themselves Consortium, and they too in Dusseldorf run a space, an off space that has some affinity to a project like the Suburban. And then riffing off of the social. So earlier I was talking to a handful of young artists thinking about participation, how the audience participates in the artwork, and how there's kind of 2 schools. There's the nightmare of participation, because we participate every time we consume. We don't go to Starbucks to buy coffee. We go to Starbucks and we get an experience, a Starbucks experience. So here we have the artist Ethan Breckenridge. He installed a functioning coffee machine in the space, and then he asked a colleague of his, a friend of his, the artist Sean Dack, to create a soundtrack to drink coffee by. So that's what he created, again, just a social space, something that we are already dealing with in terms of soliciting people and so forth, and how we start to fold in the idea of a social activity, bringing people out to the Suburban and so forth. And this is another project at the same time. Ethan Breckenridge, who fabricated Liam Gillick's work for many, many years, created this wonderful aluminum motif in the window. So he left the space empty, so we were just dealing with shadows and so forth. It's quite beautiful. And then culled from a very kind of economic position of their conduits, just kind of sliced up aluminum conduits. Waleed Beshti and Jim Welling decided to do a show together. So it's interesting, because when we invite artists, I've learned over the years, because of some pushback, I guess, often we were inviting 2 artists to come, and there has been some friction, ego friction between those artists, often kind of a wrangle over who would get what space. And here we have Waleed Beshti and Jim Welling wanting to integrate their work together. So here, that is Waleed. He's kind of cleaning his FedEx glass boxes. It's clearly riffing on Cubism, but I think more fundamentally to we artists who make things and the nightmare of shipping and or storing. So the conceit of this project was to create a glass cube, a glass volume that would fit perfectly inside of a FedEx box. And then those FedEx boxes would be shipped to whoever is going to be hosting them for exhibition, and clearly they would break. The nightmare, but also a kind of comment on the minimalist purity. And then Jim Welling, you can see a couple photographs in the background. Welling wanted to show a series of photographs that he made on the Farnsworth House, Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House, which is 30 miles just west of Oak Park in a little town called Plano. And here we have Danelle Wolford again. So Danelle Wolford was giving a performance, and you can see those objects on the wall, these kind of cut wood pieced together reliefs that are actually mounted very carefully on canvases. So there's, Joe Scanlon working on a riff between, the relief, the object, but then also the idea of painting. And you can see Danelle kind of walking through the crowd. There's another Danelle. He hired two Danelle actresses to fly in from New York and to create this performance in the space. And it was interesting because, although Joe was a little cheeky in his essay contribution to the Studio Reader, when really pushed in terms of why is he, bringing on these fictional characters, it really was about creating a figure, a beard, to make objects that he wouldn't make, that are not within his purview of studio practice. So by creating this fictional character, Danelle Wolford, he can kind of expand his range, his aesthetic range, the object and so forth. And if you go to his website, it's a great website, it's called Things That Fall, you can see a whole timeline for Danelle. So he's kind of backfilled Danelle's history, where she went to school, what degrees she has, and so forth. Another very important aspect of Suburban is actually its kind of pedagogical underpinnings. So being a professor at the School of the Art Institute is really important to kind of pull in students and let them have this kind of firsthand, but very casual, not institutional, but casual interface with the artists who are coming in. So here we have Katarina Grossa. She was out to do an exhibition. She worked in both spaces, and here we have two grad students who are helping her mix paint. It's a very specific and tedious process of getting paint to a consistency that can go through her airbrush. I like when the Suburban can actually engage in artists, offer artists an opportunity to, in this case, actually step back into the art world. So this is a video installation by the managing editor of Art Forum, one of my editors at Art Forum. His name is Jeff Gibson, and Jeff Gibson is an Australian. He has an MFA, long-time practicing artist, but kind of fell into art and text and Art Forum really quickly. And his job at Art Forum really takes at least 12 hours, if not more, a day. So he's a wordsmith. He likes to play with words and so forth. So after many years, he's actually coming back into studio practice. So it was a really great opportunity that he could try this out at the Suburban. So this piece it's a video projection called Asylum, and what you see here is crystalline banality, and then the next frame would be its definition, and it would be a fragile state of forced equanimity. Curtis Wei Lee is an artist based in Madison, Wisconsin. This is a project he did in 2000 when the Suburban was still in its early years, where he transformed the space into a two-seater functioning tiki bar. So blended drinks were served, and you can see the glow of the TV kind of tucked around the corner, and it played continuously It's a Wonderful Life. And here's another example, very much like Jeff Gibson. This is David Reed, the artist David Reed. David Reed, yes, he's been a practicing artist for a long time. However, he never had the opportunity to exhibit his works on paper, his drawings. So he was always uncomfortable. The paintings were primary. So he wanted to take an opportunity to show the drawings at the Suburban. And within 2 months, he had a full-blown, full-scale drawing show in Stuttgart. This is the artist Tony Feier, who we'll revisit again when I start talking about some fundamentals in art production. This is from 2006, and Tony just got back from Manifesta. He was participating in Manifesta, which happened in Istanbul that year, really kind of taken with the stained glass windows. So what you're looking at here is simple blue artist or painter's tape. And it's interesting because it took him well over 4 days. It doesn't look like it would take this long, but again, carefully composing and kind of laying out the patterns, the length of the tape and so forth. And it was, this is a bit gossipy, but it did change, it created a policy within the Suburban. So the Suburban, over the course of the years, has developed some guidelines. One guideline is that we do not show any Chicago-based artists. They can come from Milwaukee, St. Louis, or New Zealand, but they can't come from Chicago, and that's only because Chicago is a very small town. So pressure from grad students and faculty, the political implications were just too much. So the simple, no more Chicago artists worked. And then Tony Feier was doing a project with Gavin Turk, the London-based artist at the same time. And, Gavin Turk makes a practice out of looking at identity, kind of raunchy art practice and so forth. Gavin Turk's a sweetheart of a guy. Tony, on the other hand, had some issues. So I had to actually separate them, send one to a hotel and so forth. So after that, what we do now is if we invite Tony Feier, we would ask Tony Feier who else he would like to show with. As simple as that, we couldn't the condition of two unknowns was too much for a domestic situation. Yes, that was a bit rough. Two projects here, one by the artist Meg Do Good. Meg was a graduate student in the sculpture department at the School of the Art Institute. I never worked with her while she was there. This is from 2002. After she graduated, late May, she called and said, Michelle, you don't know me, but, over the course of my 2 years at the School of the Art Institute in the grad program and writing way too much money over in tuition, every time I was at the school, I would steal as much toilet paper as I can as a way of taking back, somehow leveling that field of, so she came over with a rental truck with a handful of friends, and she had boxes and boxes and boxes of toilet paper, so she toilet papered the house. It was great because as I came to know Meg, her sculptural project is actually the aesthetics of pranks. When do pranks go wrong? When are they overinflated? And when do they become, in this case, actually quite beautiful? Clearly something, it's not your typical toilet papering the tree. It was something more than that, and it really kind of activated and dissolved the architecture. And then the little piece that you see, this little cairn, this little aluminum geometric structure you see in the foreground is a cairn by the Danish collective N55. N55 has this, one of their projects is the Land Project, and they do not believe in the ownership of land. Fundamentally, they're socialists. So therefore, these pods, you can go to their website, and these pods are located throughout the world, from Greenland to Northern California to South America to Oak Park. And these little cairns actually mark free space. So you're welcome. And some of the, here you just have our yard is given over to free space. But in some cases, there's tracts and tracts, acreage after acreage of land that's been given to this project. And you can find them. Some people actually do kind of a N55 land pilgrimage from continent to continent, and sometimes set up a kind of a rickety residence for a while. Jean Dunning, a Chicago-based artist, before we put the policy of new Chicago-based artists in place. Jean asked, this is 2004, Jean asked if she could erect a inflatable thumb on the top of the little Suburban, and we said sure. And I always tell you out there, I call attention to the thumbnail and the details, that it does truly look like a thumb. However, Jean ended up installing it, so it doesn't look like this anatomy, but another anatomical feature. So it was inflated for the entire fall. Yes. But what I liked about this place, and artists have taken, the structure of this little space, it has some sculptural, you're compelled to it sculpturally because of its kind of geometric form and so forth, and its smallness, and its, how it's tucked between the house and the studio and so forth. So the idea that it kind of also looks like a big handle or a strange shape dreidel of some sort. So I like the idea that artist Kay Rosen has also played with the Suburban. And actually, Autumn, that's the text on the door is by the artist Kay Rosen. We have Andrea Sattel, who set up her smock shop at the Suburban, but not really. So some artists actually choose, like Meg and N55, to use the yard, the surrounding context of the Suburban, which would include the home. And in this case, we have Andrea Sattel's smock shop. These are 3 smockers that she sent out. And we, simply had, garment racks in the home that displayed her smocks. A colleague of mine at the Art Institute wanted to install text. He wanted to use the house as a site. This is the artist Joseph Grigley. Joseph Grigley is profoundly deaf, so text is of a different kind of has a different kind of weight than the hearing folk. These are texts pulled from BBC broadcast clips. Okay, so. The Suburban, I talked about the context of the suburbs, the house, the yard, and so forth. The Suburban has also taken to the road to not usually great effects, often to great disappointment, but we're game. We learn a lot. So what you're looking at here is No Soul for Sale. This is an exhibition in the Turbine Hall of the Tate Modern. Last May. So an interesting thing, I have some issues with it, still kind of sorting it out. So you have this very successful institution that turns 10 years old, and how do they celebrate their 10th anniversary? They invite spaces that have no operating budget. They gave us no resources, spaces to come to the Tate Modern. They could offer us nothing but a taped out pitch on the floor. So that's what you're looking at here. You have this kind of interesting activity going on. And again, the confusing thing for me, and it makes sense for an institution and why they don't actually use this in terms of PR, but something that I was talking about earlier today, you have this very kind of populist scenario. They had 95,000 people. This was a 3-day event in May come through because of this independent festival on this first floor, and it was open 24 hours throughout this weekend. It never closed. And then you go upstairs and you see the Tate's kind of wonky collection exhibition spaces, and then you go all the way to the very top in this kind of hierarchical ascension to an extraordinarily wonderful scholastic show of Van Doesburg's work. So you have this kind of people down below, and you kind of move on up. So it was kind of interesting in terms of how they're able to kind of interfold all of these audiences into the institution. And our contribution was simple. David Robbins, who I mentioned earlier, created a commercial for the Suburban. So we just played the commercial in our little pitch, pretty straightforward. So the Suburban, that little blocky structure, again, I can tell you how many cinder blocks it takes to build should anybody want to have a little bit of land, a little bit of yard that they want to franchise out the Suburban. So here we have an exhibition that was at the Hyde Park Art Center in Chicago, a pretty historical exhibition center in Chicago in the South Side. And it was an exhibition called Artists Run Chicago. So as I'm talking about the Suburban, those of you who understand and know the visual art landscape in Chicago understand that these kind of spaces are really what gives breath to our city. Yes, we have the Art Institute. It's an glorious encyclopedic institution. We do have the MCA, we have the Cultural Center, Hyde Park Art Center, and so forth. But our commercial galleries are kind of sketchy. There's a handful of them. Don't get me going about the collectors and how they like to go to New York to buy their work. That's how it is. So we have this kind of great wealth of people. It's almost a prerequisite for artists, young artists who are coming out of the School of the Art Institute, Northwestern, University of Illinois at Chicago, or University of Chicago, to start up a space, whether it's in their front room, whether it's in their mailbox, and these are all real spaces, or whether it's in their garage or their parlor room. So these things come and go all the time. Something quickly to be said about the Suburban is that it isn't quite networked the same way as a lot of those spaces. It has a different network, and the network is really based on, again, a kind of domestic situation. I have 3 kids. They span in age from 23 to 6. We're really in Oak Park based on the public school scenario. So the Suburban, going into its 11th year, is really a grandmother of all of these spaces. It's been around for quite some time, and it's the 6-year-old. She has some time before high school. So we're really quite committed to it. So it really is kind of a function of some of those conventional lifestyle things that my husband and I made choose to value. This is another rebuild of the Suburban in a gallery in Williamsburg, a gallery called South First. And we were invited, a similar project in Hamburg, Germany, I guess it's 2 years ago, August, called Subvision. It's kind of interesting part of Hamburg. Hamburg never saw any kind of economic downfall. It really kind of sustained its economy to the full. And so what happened here is there was this big pitch of land in which again, another kind of off-space festival occurred. This time, all of the spaces were given 3 of these shipping containers, which are a little, have a different proportion than the shipping containers we see on our trains. And originally, we were going to rebuild the Suburban. That was our negotiation with the curator. But this particular plot of land couldn't be built on. So everybody, because there's still undetonated material from World War II. So that was impossible. So we created this illusion as if the Suburban was being shipped overseas. So you can see the yellow brick wall that is recognizable as the Suburban. In addition, we invited the artist Henrik Pliny Jakobsen and the artist Olof Olsson, a Swedish artist who's based in Copenhagen. And Olof wanted to set up a little scenario. You see him here. So for a couple euro, what he would end up doing is kind of listen to your problems, to your woes, and he would give you some advice. People actually were very thankful and thought he had some good insights. So there we have Olof. And Olof is coming to the Poor Farm this summer, so I'm not sure if he's doing this project, but if you find yourself at the Poor Farm, I would sit down with him. So I'm showing you here a current installation of Josh Smith's paintings at Loring Augustine right now. And why do I show you this? Because there's, I push at his practice. I push at his practice quite a lot. There's this kind of critical underpinning to Josh Smith in terms of, the original versus the mass-produced. They're template-like. He plays with his own signature quite often. But he makes paintings in bulk, right? And he says, I stack them up because I love them all. Okay, so it's an interesting non-editing process of creating work. So I show you this now because I have to say that I use this frame in terms of thinking about the Suburban. I love all the artists who come. Like I try, everything is an experiment to some degree, so I embrace them all. So I show you this just in terms of a kind of simple frame of how I think about the Suburban. So here we have the Poor Farm. You can see here it says 1896. It was originally built in 1876. That's the foundation. It was a wood structure and burnt down. And then there's an additional building in the back, the kind of residence hall. I know some of you have been there. Just briefly, it's worth talking about what the American, what a poor farm is, or what a poor house is. It's part of the American poor farm system that was put into play in 1850 as a very progressive way of dealing with those with no means, those who are impoverished. And prior to 1850, people were sold into a type of indentured slavery. But it was its own social system. There is a jail cell in the basement. There's a graveyard in the back. The rooms are parlor, bedroom size, and so forth. So we procured this property in a location of Wisconsin that I know well. I grew up in this part of Wisconsin, northeastern Wisconsin, and we started having exhibitions every August. The first week of August, we have an annual Great Poor Farm experiment in which the free school, some of you have participated in the free school, will join us and have some programs going on, exhibitions and so forth. But we like to think of the Poor Farm as the Suburban's other, right? So here we're in a rural situation. We're across from a pasture, cow pasture. We have endless amounts of space. The Suburban, remember, tiny space, minuscule. The exhibitions at the Suburban rotate every 6 weeks. We move quickly. But the Poor Farm has exhibitions that run the course of the year, so much slower, much more conditioned. So the very first summer in 2009, we had an artist from New York named Shane Sulzer, who invited a master saddle maker from Baltimore. She drove up, they drove from Baltimore with these endless amounts of saddles, borrowed some local horses, and had a saddle fitting demonstration. And, so it was an interesting way of dealing with the context of the Poor Farm, but it was also something that Shane Sulzer, a sculptor, was interested in, the things that tether bodies together, these conduits, these connective tissues, these connective elements, and the saddle being a perfect example of that. David Robbins again. David Robbins, I will pepper this institution, or this talk with David because he teaches me much. Here we're just looking at a harlequin pattern sleeping roll bed kind of pulled out on the floor, and all that kind of the rubbish. They're candy bar wrappers, $100,000 bars, payday bars, all these kind of incongruent cheap candies that are sprinkled around. And then we had another artist, Stephanie Barber. She ended up using the field to the west, and she created sod poetry, and that's what you're looking at here. And Olivier Mosé, an installation of 6 of his monochrome. So we really see the range of work in terms of, kind of proper traditional exhibition spaces, and then projects that kind of push at boundaries. But, the Poor Farm's interesting because it comes with its own kind of amazing history. I mean, we don't know about, many of us don't know about the Poor Farm. Maybe Grandma said, save your pennies or you'll go to the Poor Farm, or the Poor House, which is the urban equivalent. But it really is quite a fascinating history. The Poor Farm dissolved in the 1930s when the American Social Security Act came into play, and they basically became state-run old folks' homes, and then sold off into private hands. So this kind of great incongruency between, the history, the rural, international contemporary art, we'd like to think, and then this other kind of experiment that happens every summer. Just quickly, what I'm, speaking of David Robbins, I'm working on a curatorial project right now that will, Marianne Boski has a new townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Marianne Boski is a dealer, a longtime dealer in New York. And this piece, this David Robbins piece called Talent, that some of you are familiar with, turns 25 this year. So I talked to Marianne about doing a curatorial project in which we'll look at all of these artists' work now. So it's really asking questions about something we don't really talk about anymore, talent. We don't talk about connoisseurship. We don't talk about talent, these things that we kind of pushed away. But how interesting to think about talent, particularly when we think of, this new, the cultural condition of networking and so forth. So what constitutes talent? What condition shaped talent 25 years ago? What were these artists making then? How has their work evolved aesthetically? How have their career trajectories changed? Why is it that we think when we see Jeff Koons or Cindy Sherman, why we think those are the successful artists, or when we think of Tom Lawson, we think of him as the teacher out at CalArts, and who is Joel Otterness? Like, who is that guy, right? So starting to look at and kind of use this piece as this really kind of basic curatorial conceit, if it's even curating. It's an artwork that's curating itself to some degree, and starting to look at that. Also, when I think about this piece, I think about the classic images of the irascibles, right? The New York School artists kind of coming together, the idea of Warhol's screen tests or yearbooks, right? So how do these things start to shape people and who they are? Just as a note, again, this was done in 1986, and at that point, these are all artists who were starting to become involved with early Metro Pictures and a Lower East Side gallery called Nature Mort, and they were all of equal standing at the time. So, right now we have this kind of separation, this hierarchy of achievement, that at that point they were all quite young Turks. Okay, so those, studio reader, curatorial projects, the Suburban, I do a lot of critical writing, I teach all these kind of things. And as I said earlier, everybody, I get the response all the time. It's like, how do you do these things? How can you do all these things? And, I always had the worst response, and that is like, I love them. I love doing all of them. I learn a lot from all of these activities. But finally, I realized there is a political dimension to these activities. And a lot of it has to do, as I was saying earlier, with the speed in which, if you're participating in these kind of relational things in which this happens, and that is the speed that one takes to move from one to the other, or the kind of headspace, which, maybe from your end you're saying schizophrenic, but it's actually not. It's more than that. It ends up starting to erode at the authority of each one of those positions. So I am not a curator. That is not my narrative, right? I am, we run these other spaces and so forth. I am not, I do write critical writing, but that's not my full narrative. So by moving through these activities, I start to kind of chip away at some of those boundaries, some of the kind of specificity of each one of those practices, and that's where the politics come in. However, when it comes to my studio practice, I'm able to slow down, and we'll get to some of that work in a little bit, but and how I hold that in privilege amongst these other things. So that is something that doesn't get compromised. So here I'm showing you just an image of Friedrich Froebel. Friedrich Froebel is the German philosopher who invented the tenets of kindergarten. And these early kind of philosophical underpinnings to how we come to know the world are really important to all studio practices, whether they're in an office studio, a home studio, and so forth. So Froebel put forth these things before words, right? How do we come to texture, to touch, learning through practical tasks such as gardening and so forth, and seeing meaningful form through a kind of orderliness. So he developed these teaching tools, 13 gifts he called them, and texture being one of them, color, but spheres, touch. We come to understand what a sphere is by touching it first. So a lot of emphasis on concrete materials. And I show you this, it may be familiar or it could look like a Tony Fair. It's not. It's just a simple exercise. So these are things that when I go into my studio, I have to manipulate. I have to come to understand before I can move into other trajectories within my studio. So, counting, we have 5 marbles resting on this egg carton. Balance, texture, size, transparency, opacity. I mean, these things become really important. These are things that, we're taught in that first year program when we're, in art school. But and unfortunately, schools do it. I go off on this tangent all the time where, schools, I think, do this wrong. This should be an upper class. We should be doing it throughout our 4 years of education, and not something we get out of the way when we do 2D or 3D or material studies. These are things that we do constantly. So I show you these with great regard. And then I am showing you a Tony Fair. This is Tony Fair's current show at Pace. Should you be in New York, you'll see these really simple water tubes, water hoses that you could pick up at Home Depot or Menards, and he has them filled with colored water, and they kind of play into line and so forth. Really simply clipped to the wall. He has blue water, red water installations as well. And then also Montessori teaching tools. These are Montessori counting beads. So again, very similar to Froebel's idea of gifts, the simple kind of order, how we come to understand things, how we come to understand geometry before, language comes into play, the complexities of language. And I'm also showing you, I'll show you a couple images by an older artist named Sheila Hicks. Sheila Hicks is known for her, pretty elaborate fiber installations. Sheila Hicks pays attention to the boundaries of the material through the exercise of technique without losing sight of the structural principles of both. So another kind of real simple, fundamental, kind of philosophical underpinning to dealing with material, dealing with something like contrast. So what we have here is just a simple, this is from 1961, study with hand-spun wool. Sheila Hicks received her MFA from Yale in 1959. She was actually a painter. She worked with Albers, George Kubler, and Louis Kahn, where she gained mastery of the relationship between materials, structure, and texture. Here's another piece. This is called Lino Diagonal from 2005. And this piece I like very much. When she first started, when she was making the transition from painting to weaving, she was using stretchers as her loom scenario. This is not one of those. This is a piece that she did at the Stedelijk Museum in 1965. It was an exhibition that ran from 65 to 67. And she found this found object. It's actually a chair seat, in which she turned into a loom. And again, the continuous, it's a single line, so we're not looking at different warped and wet thread here, but a kind of continuous loop. So again, kind of underscoring that kind of basic grid. The trace of a language, the reminder of a common experience, is fundamental to her practice. And again, I'm going to get the opportunity to see a survey show of hers in Philadelphia, two venues in Philadelphia at the end of the month. So I'm looking forward to it. I really have a kind of a adverse reaction to some of the work, but I'm showing you, some of these fundamental exercises that I really hold close. So these are just a series of paper weavings that I do on a regular basis in the studio. Simple paper weaving with colored aid paper. Again, they're all half-inch bands. This is an exercise that's probably familiar to you from your own kindergarten or first grade experience. And then I have I'd like to place them on the floor as mats. So you have that kind of, slight, maybe obvious incongruency between, the floor, underfoot, and the delicacy of paper. So I'll just show you a handful of these. I've mentioned this before. It's a simple studio conceit in which I have a tendency to divide my studio practice. So what I'm showing you now, these kind of very fundamental exercises in terms of, in this case, two-dimensional design, I classify them as drawing, and then I have my painting practice. And each of those practices have different, they maintain different criteria for how they succeed. The painting practice, I still, it's a capital P. I'm sitting here and telling you that, I'm holding painting to a higher regard, or a different regard, I should say, than the drawing. And the drawing, again, taking multiple forms. It has nothing to do with, graphite on paper. But the idea of pushing through, it's much more philosophical, executing it, this kind of, the rigor, the task of going through these simple weaving exercises. And then this is a wall flocking at a gallery that's no longer in existence called Feier. It was in Chelsea for a while, and this is from 2002, an exhibition that Tim Griffin, a curator and longtime editor of Art Forum, put together called Compression. And I was flocking spectrums onto the wall. So again, dealing with these, some of the same kind of opposites. So you have flocking, which is actually, just tiny bits of rayon pumped into spray mount on the wall. And, you just vacuum the thing up when it's done. And, over the course of the time, it falls, literally falls off the wall. But dealing with light, these kind of light effects, and also thinking through the aesthetic of wonder, not the aesthetic of the sublime, not the kind of power of the unknown, the dread of the unknown, but that of wonder, something that still gives us pause but can be undone through kind of mathematical equations. Coming to know a little science will, reveal how a spectrum breaks. And I did a series of these. Again, you guys are very familiar and probably compelled, as I am, after a great snow, and you have these planes of architecture. I mean, it's as if you're buying, a new sheet of Arches paper and the potential of that. And that brings us actually upstairs. This is Fischl and Weiss's The Green Light from 1993. I remember seeing this piece at their survey show here years ago. I can't even remember when that was now. It must be 96, something like that. Fischl and Weiss, something close to that. And being awestruck. I mean, that was also the first time I got to see the way things go, which is, really spectacular. But it was kind of the vernacularness of what's going on here, and the simple, refractory of the simple plastic cup being rotated and having a light projected through. And A Shot in the Dark. It's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about this show, and I have, initially it felt like this affect, this kind of just fundamental there's something really right about this exhibition, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what that is, and I've been dropping in network systems, a little bit social activity participation throughout this conversation, but there's something about the works in this exhibition that are comfortable within their own limitations. It doesn't mean they don't nod to some very kind of powerful or abstract concepts, whether it's time, whether it's space, or so forth. But there's something about their self-knowing who they are or what they are as objects in the world, and they don't seem their kind of fundamental meaning doesn't rely on reaching too far out. It's not something that's beside itself. We talk a lot about contemporary painting, about painting that's beside itself, the structures that surround it, that there's something honed in and comfortable within the limitations of the work in this exhibition. And I think that's welcoming, and I think a lot of viewers can recognize that. Thanks, Eric. Okay, so I'm segueing to the painting. I'm showing you here a photograph by the Blumas, not to be confused with the Beckers. They're another couple, photographer couple, in Germany. And what you see here is, this is a little bit, the Blumas basically poke a little bit at middle-class Germans and some of their values. So they actually dress up, they don themselves as middle-class Germans. They'll look like they're going on holiday in the Black Forest, and they're standing amongst the Black Forest, and it's devastated by acid rain, right? But it's still a photograph, and they can bring it back to their bridge club. So here you have an image, which I actually am very sympathetic with, and that is, potatoes, staple, something unyielding, going out of control, right? So something that is that would cause chaos in the everyday, and something that should actually ground not only a class of people, but kind of a domestic situation. So I have to avoid this at all costs. So again, to have all these things in orbit or up in the air, to engage in them, there has to be some kind of control. So I showed this just as a kind of anecdote. And the paintings also deal with time. When I start showing you the paintings, you'll get a sense of how some of these works that I'm showing you, how they influence the work, how we think about them. So we have Ankuwara, of course, and his workaday paintings, the idea of a work time. And then Baldassare, I will not make any more boring art. So fundamentally, the paintings and even the silverpoint work, it's essential that they're boring, right? It's essential that they take time, that they do not move in that network space that the Suburban or the Poor Farm or even critical writing or even teaching works in, that there's something else. So I'm going to go quickly through a series of work that spanned from 1995 to 2003, and these are my indexical paintings. Right out of grad school, I kind of set up a studio in which I was really looking for that order that you do not see in the Bluma's potatoes going out of control, but the order in a domestic home, the backdrops. So what we're looking at is everything from curtain weaves to blanket weaves to paper towel patterns and so forth. And also they're indexical by the fact that these things ended up being almost stencil-like. I would stretch them over panel, create this negative space and go in and fill them up. Fill in the negative and or positive space. So domestically called paintings registering the visible and the invisible functional underpinnings and systems and order in everyday life. So they really had this function. This is that pragmatic that when Ashley introduced me, the kind of pragmatical underpinning that the work has to take. Car beads, these things that we sit on in the car. And then at some point in the late 90s, they were rendered with a really common oil-based enamel, the stuff that you get at the hardware store. And so they had this kind of glossy utility to their surface. And at some point, I started pumping that flocking in. So, as I was flocking on the walls, I decided to, pump flocking into wet enamel. So what you're looking at here is that white, the kind of white webbing ends up being very fuzzy. I mentioned Galen Gerber. I don't think I'm going to go too much into platformist positions. Galen Gerber, way back when I was talking about Dave Muller and 3-Day Weekend, did that canvas that fit kind of perfectly into that wonky wall in the Suburban. Galen Gerber makes, it's a platformist practice in which he sets up opportunities in which other people work on the work or other people have work hung on his canvases. I push at it. It's challenging to me because I keep Galen's practice close, because as much as I want it to be a critique of authority, a critique of authorship, Galen always responds, Michelle, it's just, I'm having fun, it's an experiment. And I think it's more than that. Galen's detractors consider it parasitic. So if he's creating a large wall at the Museum of Contemporary Art and hangs a Sherry Levine painting on it, plywood painting, at what point is he gleaning some of the authority of Sherry Levine? Or at the same time, the proponents of platformists is creating another condition for others, right? So it has this tension. So I made 3 paintings with Galen. He will create these 40-inch by 40-inch square canvases with his, trademark Galen gray, and then have other people paint on it. So you're looking at a flock daisy pattern. And a series of flocked paintings created specifically for the kind of modernist chairs in the collection of the Cranbrook Art Museum. So I want to just briefly, it was kind of a sober hit in terms of the critical response I was getting to the indexical paintings, those backdrops. I was receiving a lot of attention, which is always good, but the attention was coming actually through a conduit that I wanted to push against. There was a lot of talk about women's work. There was a lot of talk about, a middle-class scenario, that these things register middle class, and yes, a lot of the granny squares or crocheted blankets do that. But again, pragmatically, I was actually needing order out of them. Those were subtexts, but it seemed to be that text. That's how I was being framed. So I really had to kind of pull back and actually just establish a kind of order, a kind of rhythm, look into math more carefully, and strip away some of the kind of localized or familiar reference of some of those paintings. So I started working on these tondos, and without an index, but they're a construction, they're an Archimedes spiral. So basically I start just off center and I start rotating, and an Archimedes spiral is each rotation of the spiral is of equal distance. And what was happening here is, these are a fool's game, quite honestly. It's the old mind-body split to some degree. So, the idea of achieving a kind of perfection is impossible in these kind of paintings, because they register the body, they register time, they register material disintegration. So as I'm working on these, a lot of the paint itself will start to evaporate and become more concentrated. And you can kind of see the kind of rotations, the bands that happen here. Every time I leave and come back, the pressure of the brush changes a little bit. So, and the space between them. So I couldn't, these are just records. They ended up being like a Geiger counter to some degree. What happens is when I reach the end, the first point that falls off of the edge, the painting is finished, and it does this interesting kind of binary again between painters. If I'm a painter and looking at this, they're really interesting with the crest, right, where it fails conceptually to be perfect, to kind of fill up that Archimedes spiral perfectly in geometric form, filling up the contour of the tondo. That's the perfect conception that I'm setting out to do. I work on them flat and I don't even see them until I flip them up. However, that crest, that kind of figure-ground relationship is much more interesting as a painting. So I have this kind of back and forth, in terms of a conceptual project, painting project, and where they fail and where they succeed. In terms of scale, they range anywhere from 20-inch diameter and even a little bit smaller in some of my tests to 80-inch diameter. I can't reach to a center greater than 80 inches. That's just what my body arc ends up being. I'm going to talk a little bit about, just briefly about not the time, I guess it is the time, but a reference that I really like to overlay over these works, and it has to do with the author, David Foster Wallace, who recently committed suicide. The work that he was, the novel he was working on upon his death is being called The Pale King. I don't know if that's going to stick when they actually do release the novel. And it's centered around a monastic group of IRS agents, tax return agents. So if any of you understand or know or even had the great gusto to read Infinite Jest, which I tried, you understand that the force of that book is about losing oneself, looking for a form of distraction, of entertainment in which one loses their humanity, right? You literally poop your pants. You go, it's something that you're cast into a space that we lose ourselves, right? But we have this search, right? Particularly we think about this with distraction and so forth. So here he sets up his new, he kind of ham ties himself with this new novel, right? Where, what can you do with a novel with, IRS agents? Like where do you go? What is the narrative arc of something like that? Very peculiar. But that's, it was truly intentional. So he establishes it's looking at Infinite Jest, and what he ends up doing is thinking that before you get to that point of distraction, where are you? Where at what point in your life do you seek out that distraction? It's usually when we're bored. Right? So he's talking here about like crushing boredom ends up being the key, the remedy to to tripping ourselves, to losing oneself. And the idea, my understanding, again, it's not released, but my understanding with this text is that it's going to be a play with this, that this boring place, this utter boring place is where we have to learn to be. Right? We have to learn to understand it. And we live in a culture that does not want us to be comfortable in that place. We have plenty of distraction. So these paintings, I'm trying to come to terms with, again, you can imagine how boring they are to make and how long they take, but that boring actually does have a function, again, particularly in terms of all those other social structures that I was talking about. A little bit, Foster Wallace writes, the central challenge of the contemporary world is not that we don't know how to live meaningful lives, but it's that we don't even seem to be able to focus on the question for very long, right? So we keep moving off of the question. And again, I'm not going to get into my Marxist spiel about why, but we do have a force that moves us along. So these are boring works of art. I will make boring art, and they have a function. I'm showing you here Tara Donovan's a recent show. I think it's still up at Pace Gallery. So Tara Donovan, uses stuff, massive amounts of stuff. These are her little pinhead paintings. And again, the randomness of composition really bothers me. I really push at her work quite a lot. So even though there's this again the kind of the tedium of bringing pieces together, massive amounts of material together, they're best when they're looking at issues of consumption, and they trip into a kind of great abstraction. But often I push at them because they seem random in terms of their compositions. Just an image of the studio. I thought it's only fair that I exposed my studio. This is an installation of the tondos at an exhibition that I had this summer in London at a space called Rocket Gallery. So you can kind of get a sense of their scale and the difference. Again, sameness and difference also at play. And then needing to break away just physically, just the kind of body memory of making those points. I needed to do this. I needed to kind of pull to move the body in a different way, but at the same time being central. So again, not interested in a kind of invention using the idea of a radial motif consistently. So we're looking at just some 60-inch by 60-inch silver point on paper. Silver point on panel. This is 60 inches. The one that's here, I believe, is, I want to say 24 inches. But they get up to approximately 60 inches. And as with employing silver, they change pretty drastically over time. They tarnish, of course, as we know. So they'll change, and they start from the outside and they move in. So they always have this kind of responsive, ephemeral quality. This is just an exhibition, and so you can kind of get a scale, kind of the reflective qualities. It's on black gesso, so it's interesting because as the silver point starts to tarnish, starts to darken, you get it's a surface release. So you have reflective quality where the metal has been pulled, and then you have this flat black gesso that kind of absorbs light. So you still, despite contrast starting to be pulled down as the piece starts to tarnish, you still have the contrast in surface. Mary Heilemann and Wendy White exhibition. This is a project that I did in Zurich in last fall with the artist and critic theorist Jeremy Gilbert Rolfe, who is professor, head of grad school at Arts Center. And if you want to know anything about beauty and contemporary art, I send you first to Jeremy. So it was really interesting spending time with him because he was, Michelle, your work is so effing boring, and he would, just kind of blatantly, be forthcoming in his lack of interest in my lack of invention. As his work, as you see, the pink canvases deal with invention. So thinking through the idea of the confusion of network structures, the idea of being unable to locate value, throwing paintings, throwing my drawings, my paintings, kind of literally pulling them off the wall and sending them into orbit. And I think of these mobiles as constellations, and I make these with my husband. And constellations are interesting because it allows one to decipher the truth of an object without imposing an outside definition, because you have this movement, this rotation. A constellation cannot merely be grasped as a conceptual apparatus. A constellation is a metaphor for the process of decoding, so painting and color. So it is painting outside of itself. So how I'm coming to understand this kind of thrust, this painting conceit right now is kind of, throwing it into motion, juxtaposing it, thinking about the orbit. It's interesting because it's a good time to be doing this, but you put it into orbit, you throw it in the air, and quite honestly, if you ask me where it's going to land as we play with value, it's going to land right back on the wall. I'm not talking about my own work, but the idea of work will go right back to the wall. Maybe a little cynical, but so it's an interesting time as things start looking next to itself, besides itself. So yes, you can see some of the silverpoint panels are two-sided that are suspended with pretty much hammered out garbage cans and heavily enameled. So I just want to quickly walk through, as we're coming to a close here, some of the work that I've been doing, some of the work I've done in the past with my husband. So we're working collaboratively on these mobiles, but when we first got out of grad school, way back, early 90s, we left Chicago. We both got our MFA degrees in Chicago. He received his at University of Illinois at Chicago, a very good school at the time. He was in school with Toro Herrera and Tom Friedman, amongst others. And I was at a kind of stinky school up on the North Shore, Northwestern. It's not stinky across the board, but the art program was not so great. Ed Paschke was there, so it had this kind of it was the old guard. So we finished our degrees and we ended up moving to Milwaukee. We had some young children, and living in Chicago is hard. It's expensive. It takes a lot out of you in terms of time. So bought a very inexpensive little house on the river, and ended up starting to work together, starting to use our family as a way of thinking through some ideas. And mind you, this is the 90s. It's the decade of Rire Tervanige. This is Felix Gonzalez Torres, who actually we hosted a little dinner for him, and he was able to read a lovely story to my son, a bedtime story. So Milwaukee was a really interesting place. It had potential. There was nothing really fixed about it. But we were missing our colleagues. We were missing a kind of discourse that we had when we were in graduate school. So anyways, I took a position where I was a high school teacher at a prep school, and what you're looking at here is a large-scale photograph. I took this position at this prep school as a high school art teacher, so my kids could get an elementary school education. That I could not afford to give them otherwise. And the public schools weren't terrific where we were living. So we all had to wear uniforms to school. And what we're looking at here is Peter, second grade, came home and he had his pants on backwards all day. But that was, that's interesting in terms of thinking through development, right? In the third grade, that really could have been a real problem, right? He would have been picked on. He wouldn't be able to sleep at night. So the idea of at what point do we stop care? We don't care. There's other things that pull us through the world, and at what point are we fixed? And we become superficial in some of the things that surround us. And the beauty now is at what point do we start wearing our pants on backwards again and not care? That's in my future. So we were looking at the kids, and it's interesting because, I had my little painting studio in the basement. I was doing all those indexical paintings I was talking about earlier. Brad had his painting studio, but we were doing a lot of, we were working with the kids a lot in terms of trying to answer questions, like how can we be good parents? How can art actually present situations in which we can kind of look at who we are? This is a project at White Columns. It was Paul Ha was the director at the time, and he remembered this crazy couple in Milwaukee they were making work about their kids, and he was putting a show together called Fandom. I always thought it was weird. I don't think of myself as fans, but yes, there's a lot of parents who live vicariously through their kids. I don't think we do that, but anyways, we were game, and we just extended the invitation to our oldest kid. At this point, he's 12, and he brought his collection of trading cards and just kind of set up shop and showed people his trading cards and traded a little bit, but it started to become, we were doing so much work around the kind of conceit of the family that we were starting to have some ethical questions about using the kids. And in this case, you can see a Reese's, you see candy bar wrappers, you see juice containers. I mean, asking a kid that's, maybe he was even 9 at the time, to sit in a gallery with people mulling about for 3 hours is kind of maybe not so good for him. So like trying to think about like when are we pushing kids, when are we using them, and kind of pulling back a little bit. Oliver, he's now 18, but he unlike Peter, who's doing perfectly well in college, Oliver has been a bit of a trouble son. So when he was in school, when he was in pre-kindergarten, his teachers thought a little behavior modification would be at play. So, you know, it's really simply the little Post-it note. If he's good in the morning, he gets a smiley face. He's good in the afternoon, he gets a smiley face. So a little reward, a little kind of recognition of his day. So we inflated these to extraordinarily large scale. This is really good, and I'm not showing you the ones where it's a lot of narrative that says he was bad, he took a kid down by the knee in line today. So we had those as well. This was the summer of '97. They were installed in Milwaukee, San Francisco, and Chicago at 3 different locations. And then another piece, just to give you a sense of this project. I like this one very much, only because it turned out okay. So we were asked to produce a piece. It was for a magazine. It wasn't New York Examiner, but something similar. I think it's White Walls. Anyways, the project is we ended up giving the oldest kid $100 to go to the Toys R Us to buy whatever he wanted. And $100 was a lot for us at that time. So we were saving some money, and we didn't give him any conditions, right? You know, we didn't say, do not buy violent toys, you know, do not buy whatever. And the only condition was that he had $100. He couldn't go over. So he filled the cart with violent toys, and he bought nothing for his brother. So, you know, total failures. We're walking out of we're walking out of the Toys R Us parking lot, really feeling like we failed totally as a parent. But interesting all the same. He still talks about this project. Okay, I'm just going to go through a couple other projects. Again, the collaborative work that I'm doing with my husband right now. This is an exhibition that I curated at White Flag Project in St. Louis. It's our work. You see those the lengths of aluminum bleachers, and then you can see my 2-sided panels suspended from those bleachers. Annie Eastman has some of the mirrored mobiles. This kind of great orange curl is by the Danish artist Ib Gibson, who is now deceased. Other artists, Greg Bowden, was in the show. So again, really looking at what that means to put things, to kind of move things around, not just rotate, but to think about that idea of the constellation, or the idea of putting things in motion as some kind of metaphor for a network system. Here's a detail. And then even pushing it further, was an exhibition that I did last summer at Leo Kooning Project. It was an exhibition that I titled, I Speak Now from an Aesthetic and Artistic Point of View When I Say That Life with Michelle Grabner is Dull. So what I ended up doing is working on this kind of display structure. Again, it really is kind of a networking system where I'm associating myself with, or I can't say I was associating myself because that's this Katarina Grossa or Molly Suckerman Hartong are making paintings the way I do, but it's another kind of network that's set up. And they provide me, they work through color, they work through experimentation the way my work doesn't. So they kind of compress those together. So that's what you're looking at here. And this is a project that I recently did in Chicago, in a small space in Chinatown. That's called a Peregrine Program. And again, thinking of what paintings can hold, painting besides itself, but in this case, I wanted to think what was on the back of paintings. So what you see on the back of this 80-inch round painting is not only a photograph of the house that you remember with the smock shop, but a painting by my husband, my daughter's chair, one of the silver points, an old indexical painting, all kind of attached, almost like an oyster on the back of this large canvas. And it's all suspended and weighted down by this kind of concrete form that we created that when we were thinking about, I was mentioning the Van Doesburg show, so thinking about Van Doesburg. And then the front side is, just, on the straightforward Archimedes spirals. just a detail of the back. And then a project in San Francisco at a space called Gallery 16. You can see two, again, 80-inch round paintings suspended as the backside in conjunction with some body parts from a 73 Mercedes diesel, my old car, which is nothing but a rust bucket. But again, covering them with enamel and so forth and creating this suspension and creating a kind of movement. What's interesting about this one, it's all held up by this locker that's filled with heavy sand. So that heavy sand locker is kind of being torqued up. The narrative potential is the thing that's throwing me with these in terms of the suggestion of like the weighted locker and so forth. So that reference is coming back and haunting in a bit. And finally, to conclude, you guys have been really patient. This is a show that came down on Sunday. It's Shane Campbell Gallery in Chicago. This is their new space, the third. It was the third project in the space, and we're looking at just a handful of silver point, gold point, copper point, and graphite panel drawings on panel. And I don't have any decent side shots, but the kind of materiality, you can see the plywood, there's a nice object hood to them. And here you're looking at a copper, and I'm returned to the grid, so it's the referencing of the gingham pattern. There's kind of an interesting touch to them that I'm quite interested in as well. And to really to throw things kind of wickedly out of line, the idea of creating a little bit of illusion. So this is a graphite drawing. So with the slightest bit of rendering, what you can do with that flatness of the gingham pattern. I was thinking a lot about Ad Reinhardt and how you can move from an Ad Reinhardt abstraction into this almost domestic woven situation. So that brings us back to Sheila Hicks a little bit. This is gold. Gold is not so interesting. It stays very inert. It doesn't transform the way silver or copper does. And I'm showing you here a Ray Morton drawing. So these are this is kind of this lovely grid that she has done with, that she did. I think this is 73 with her thumb, just kind of smearing charcoal. And then a final gold one, and I think that's it. Thanks, you guys. I know. What's the time? Emily has a question. Thank you.
Yeah. So you talk about pushing a lot, pushing against other people's practices that have happened in the past or that are your contemporaries. And I know that you get this question a lot, and I'm probably not going to ask it just right. But this question of all of these different ways that you engage in the art world, and with your making boring paintings.
Yeah.
And then having your critical writing and your curatorial practice and your teaching practice, could those paintings be happening or those drawings be happening? Could they still be political if you didn't have these other things that you do in your art practice? Like, would the boringness still be interesting or political without this other part of your participation in the art world?
Yeah, I think the right answer would be no. Right, I think they would be formal investigations. But they're also tied to a kind of again, thinking through history and thinking of Reinhardt and thinking of transformation, particularly with some of that material and how that again the idea of using metal point and how its inability to be fixed, right? So I'm really interested in the thingness of them. And again, I'm sorry I didn't give you any good examples of kind of the side, and so you can really get the thingness quality of them. But that thingness quality erodes. So you have not only the value of, when we're talking about like how we do not know how to value, value has been kind of thrown up there. What we do know is what the gold price is for today. I can tell you what gold is going through. I can tell you what silver is going through. So there's these kind of fixed values, and they're typically material values that we have in culture. So those are at play, but then we also have the dissolving, the kind of the transformation of what goes on. And so, when this institution acquires a silver point drawing, what they acquired is going to be quite different than at the end of the run of the show, just in terms of how the transformation of that material happens. Is that political? I think there's some pokes at, the inability to value or kind of undercutting value. And as you know, particularly in the art world, we're constantly, it's a facet of our world that's constantly creating value. You have dealers walk into their commercial galleries every day and invent value, right, in terms of how they assign it to something. So to kind of undercut that, the push at it, I think has some interesting critical qualities, but I would say you wouldn't look at that without the context of everything, as you aptly sketched out. It would lose some of their kind of political thread amongst those narratives. And that, yeah. Eric. Wait for the...
It was interesting to hear you talk about all these different spheres of activity. And one of the things that I think about when I see your paintings is an approach to marking out the time of lived experience rather than time as a kind of abstract notion. So I wonder, in that spirit, I wonder if you have a daily routine that you're fixed to. And
right. That's a good question, and I don't think I was terribly articulate when I talked about Ankwara and his workaday clock, right? I mean, in terms of the idea of Western work and so forth. I don't, based on some of these other things. I mean, I tell you that I get up very early in the morning. You would ask me 2 years ago what 4:30 looked like, I would have said hell, and now it's the best time of the day. So I get up early and I go right to the studio, and then I get back to the studio. But sometimes I get back after an hour being in the office downtown, and I get to spend the day into the evening. And sometimes I have to, I wait till the evening after the kids are in bed and get back out there. So it really is kind of pieced together. I mean, I do. The regular, I would say that if there is a clock, it actually is the academic clock. It's September to May that really ends up kind of shaping two kind of discrete patterns of work and life based on the academic clock and when I'm teaching and so forth. I can tell you that I had quite a glorious gift, maybe it wasn't so glorious, my sabbatical year, actually it was almost 2 years, I was a wreck. I mean, I couldn't, I need something to kind of push off of. So that was a little too difficult. So yeah, it's academic clock.
I was going to ask you, do you ever, over here, do you ever draw or paint outside? And I was also wondering if do you drink coffee or take caffeine when you
Drink a lot of coffee. Well into the evening I drink coffee. And you're just commenting on how fast I talk, right? How much?
No, I was going to, when you're painting smaller details or trying to, control your hand, sometimes coffee's not a great thing or caffeine's not a great thing, but it definitely keeps you moving. But do you like painting outside or drawing outside in the sun?
No, don't do that.
Okay.
My husband, though, is quite the plein air painter, and has rigged up a nice little studio in the back of the pickup up in Wisconsin, and kind of moves around. So
Sure.
He's quite the romantic painter in terms of landscape and so forth. But,
do you listen to music while you're drawing?
I listen to television for the most part. I'm a big fan of soap operas, and again. Because of the lack of invention in narrative. I mean, right now the pressure to invent our own narratives is so pervasive that actually the soap opera, which is actually falling, I mean, they're dropping like flies because they don't hold up to reality TV. They don't hold up to the other forms of contemporary storytelling that we've become accustomed to as of late. So I quite like the predictability of them. You could probably see that I pull towards predictability. So that's my afternoon. So when I find myself in the studio in the afternoon, and I try to be out there by 1 o'clock for my story, one of my stories. Yeah. So, but usually bad TV, we don't have, I think, yeah.
Thank you.
Michelle, maybe we should wrap it up so people have a chance to.
Oh, yeah. Okay, there's one more question, though? Is that right? No? You're just oh, you're the holder.
I'm just running, yeah.
Come on, give me a question holder. No. All right, you guys, thanks.